Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Lisa Dubé. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at M2B Connect, and I'm very happy that you've joined us today. We are going to be discussing how Australian companies that are developing pharmaceutical and biological medical products can incorporate the voice of the consumer using best practice into the product design and commercialization process. Next slide. I'd like to start today's session by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the many lands on which we are all meeting today. Today, I'm speaking to you from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the traditional owners, custodians, and lore keepers of the world's oldest living culture, and pay our respects to the elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So now I'm going to just briefly outline how the webinar is going to go. I will give just a very brief overview of M2B Connect for those who may not be as familiar with it. And then we will launch in to an open presentation with Karen Carey with questions from the audience. And the format of this webinar is going to be really open, really discussion centered. And so please feel free to put your questions in the chat or the Q&A box, and we will bring them up and also just raise questions as we go to make sure that we're discussing what might be helpful to you. And now just a little bit about M2B Connect. If you don't know who we are Australia's Life Sciences Innovation Accelerator, an independent, not-for-profit organization established by the government to champion the continuing growth of Australia's vibrant medical products sector. We do this through a few ways, mostly delivering accelerated programs for startups and SMEs to grow and scale and prosper. And we also improve access to global supply chains and international markets through our trade delegations and MOUs with key markets for medical companies, given it's a global market. We also provide connections, information, and opportunities for startups and SMEs developing medical products. We can put you in touch with the right infrastructure and let you know what's happening in the ecosystem. And we also advise and create programs from the innovation sector. You might have heard of some of our programs today. We are also an industry partner organization for the Industry Growth Program and its advisors, specifically for the biomedical sector. We support the program by offering intermediary service meetings, workshops, and events such as this, reports and monthly communications, and general support to our GP clients. If you haven't checked out our dedicated Industry Growth Program private webpage, please contact myself, or you can find a link at the end of your monthly IGP Catalyst newsletter. Here is our national team that help provide support to the Industry Growth Program and clients. We also draw on members of our other programs and accelerated services according to the most relevant expertise for the company we are supporting. So we really try to leverage everyone's networks in this area. We have a couple of upcoming delegations that might be of interest if you are interested in moving into the United States. We have Bio coming up in June, and we also have a MedTech conference coming up in October. These delegations are really helpful if you're considering entering these markets. We support companies to get the most out of these key major conferences, particularly facilitating networking and relationships over the 2-day site visit and a pre-conference event with key dignitaries and companies represented. This can really help make a difference, developing those well-needed relationships before you actually need them. We also can help you with marketing if you go to the MedTech conference, because we can put your logo up onto the pavilion. The pavilion is a good base that you can use for all of your meetings as well. So I encourage you, if you are thinking about going to either of these conferences, to sign up to our delegation. It really does make a difference. And we try to keep it as affordable as we can. And now on to our keynote speaker for today. I'm delighted to welcome Karen Carey. She's nationally recognized health consumer advocate and strategist. She's co-funded Tonic Health Media, Australia's largest out-of-home health and wellbeing network, and served as its founding CEO. Her advocacy is shaped by lived experience, including 5 open heart surgeries, a heart transplant, and multiple strokes, making her a very powerful voice for improving safety and quality in healthcare. Karen has served on the NHMRC Council, chaired its inaugural Community and Consumer Advisory Group, and is a widely published researcher. So thank you, Karen, for joining us. We also have joining Karen and myself today, another MTP Connect colleague, Dr. Michelle Lamb, who is Director of the Clinical Translation and Commercialization MedTech Program, where she supports the advancement of high-impact MedTech innovations and has academic background in physiology and pharmacology. Prior to joining MTP Connect, Michelle was based at St. Vincent's Hospital, Melbourne, working in clinical research management, where she established a co-designed consumer and community involvement program for an orthopedic research center of excellence. It's with this practical lens that Michelle is joining the conversation today. So again, thank you, Michelle, for joining us. And now I will hand over to you, Karen, to start leading the discussions, the slides you've prepared.
Thanks very much, Lisa. Just to start off with, I will take 30 seconds to talk about my own patient experience. As Lisa said, I've got a long cardiac history. I've had 5 open heart surgeries, including a transplant. I now, along that experience, I had 4 ablations, 5 pacemakers, had a couple of strokes, and now post-transplant, I have kidney disease. So I have quite extensive patient experience. And the first thing I'd like to open with is that it is essential that the person that you have doing the consumer role or the patient advocacy role definitely has the right lived experience. We produce frameworks to guide people to be able to consider consumer issues separate to lived experience, but you really need someone with lived experience. You get a lot of value out of them because they will have the practical experience for exactly what it is to be the end user of the product that you're suggesting. So that's sort of the first thing I think that's important. Can we move on to the next slide? So why involve consumers? Firstly, it has become essential for grant funding that you have and be able to demonstrate consumer involvement. And that really has, if we're all honest about it, that's been the big driver for increased consumer involvement. But different organisations have different reasons why they might involve consumers. Universities and medical research institutes, their big driver is the grant requirements. They have ethical drivers. So you will have heard the expression, nothing about us without us, which I think they borrowed from somebody else. But, that's quite often used to justify why you need consumer involvement. But there are other ethical issues, and consumers have a different perspective on those ethical drivers. Universities and MRIs also want to increase their knowledge, and sometimes involving consumers can be absolutely essential to increasing knowledge of what actually happens when a device or a drug or another therapeutic good is used in a setting. Healthcare services have different drivers for involving patients. Mostly they're driven by patient and community expectations. Quite often these days, healthcare services are putting in grant applications, so they have that driver, and they also are subject to ethical drivers. So they have reporting mechanisms that require consumer involvement. The therapeutic goods industry, which is what we're really talking about today, I think has different drivers for why you might want to involve consumers. When you look at a commercial situation, you really need to have your end user involved at a very early stage to make sure that you are meeting the needs of the end user. And I have seen countless times where researchers have come up with research projects, they've been funded, they do the research, and then at the end of it, the consumer says, yeah, but this doesn't work. I mean, truly things where wheelchairs have been designed that don't have adequate safety belts and just very practical things that had they involved a consumer in the beginning, it wouldn't have been that error and there wouldn't have been that wastage. So I think that for industry, the most important reason to involve consumers is to identify, minimize, and mitigate risk in the development of a therapeutic product.
I think that's a really good point, Karen.
Yeah.
I have heard quite a few projects where there just wasn't enough thought put into consulting consumers, or they thought it was a tick box exercise, and so they did it a very minimal method, and it has led them to the point where eventually the flaws in the strategy, because sometimes it can also be a little bit difficult to understand exactly who your consumer and who the product end user will be. Um, and it's led to companies folding because they just ran out of money because they'd have to backtrack too much once they found out that there was major issues with their strategy. So it's really
Yeah.
in some ways a very economical use of money. So it's very smart as well.
Yeah, look, we're largely cheap. So it doesn't cost companies a lot to do their consumer involvement. And, I think in other industries, market research is so fully embedded, you would never think of developing a product
Mm.
without going to end users. And it's interesting that health still has some reluctance to do that. Just to your question about involving the right person, in my experience, it is the most common feedback I get from universities, healthcare services, and the little bit of industry that I've been involved with is that they get a consumer in and the person isn't helpful at all. And that's because, people say to me they want to talk about their hip surgery. And that's because they've got the wrong type of person. So for me, this is the method that I use. Different organizations use different methods. So I don't want to suggest this is the only method, but I find this method really helpful. And that is to divide people into patients, consumers, community, and public. And a single person can fulfill all of those categories at different times, but their objective is different. So I define patients as someone who's currently using the healthcare system, and their objective is to maximize their own health outcome. A consumer is someone who has in the past or expects in the future to use the healthcare system, and their objective is to maximize safety, quality, access, effectiveness, and cost effectiveness of the system. The community has in the past or in the future used the healthcare system, and it is a group of people with a specific need. So you might find a small community in a hospital of people that have childhood diabetes, or you might go to a wider community and say a health service might need to consult community related to services that they're providing. So community expands in its size, but it always involves a group of people with a common special interest. And then there's the public. And the public have in the past or in the future expect to use the healthcare system, but they're interested in maximizing safety, quality, access, and cost effectiveness like the consumers, but their focus is much more on social justice and on cost effectiveness. So how can we produce the best system for the least amount of money? Can I have the next slide, please? So when you involve these different people, you'll be involving them for different reasons. So it's really important to have a think about why you need a consumer advocate in the first place, or you might need a patient advocate. And to be clear, once you understand what your need is, it's going to be much easier to find the right person. Just in terms of my own personal experience, when I'm in hospital or I'm getting treatment, I'm a patient. And my interest is only in maximizing my own health outcome. But once I'm not in that situation, I can become a patient advocate in that I can talk on behalf of other people who have my condition or who have a specific experience of healthcare that I want to talk about. But I become a consumer representative when I separate from that personal experience and start to talk about the system issues, how my lived experience affects the system. So sometimes you can get a single person and they can fulfill all of these boxes for you. But quite often, if what you want is the patient experience, you might need to get a patient advocate, or a small group of patients in to talk about that specific experience. And you may need someone different when you move on to consumer representation. So just think about, the stage that you're at. For a patient advocate, you might want someone who has actually experienced the condition, the treatment, or the service. You might find someone who has an understanding of unmet need. It's increasingly happening that organizations are involving patients at the very beginning in order to define their unmet need. I sit on multiple panels assessing grant applications for grants, and you can really tell the difference with an organization who's applying for a grant that has good patient or consumer involvement at the very beginning in the way that they state their unmet need. And I think the industry could probably value the same sort of consultation. Also, patients can tell you about patient acceptability, so of research methods, of treatments, or of service. I recently was asked to comment on an application and a methodology that required patients to wear a device for 12 months. And, they were a long way into their process in developing this device, when in actual fact, I think that the likelihood that they could conduct research and get people to actually wear that device for 12 months was very low, and therefore their research was likely to fail just because of that one thing. So sometimes you can save people a lot of money and save a lot of expensive mistakes. So a consumer representative will talk about safety, quality, efficacy, access, cost effectiveness, and sometimes about ethics. Not all consumer representatives can talk about ethics. And if your issue is an ethical one, sometimes you might be best to get a specialist. Community might talk about unmet need, how they access services, the cost effectiveness, gap payments, the quality of access to services, and then ethics. So if you have a specific ethic question, you might go to a community to see what their feedback is. Quite often you can get involved in ethical arguments that are quite technical and the bar is very, very high. But when you actually go to a community of people who want this service and see an unmet need, you might find that the bar is much lower in practice. And I think that that's very helpful. It's, in terms of the consumer movement, I think the most practical application of this, or the most obvious case of this, has been in relation to privacy. So when I started as a consumer advocate, we were very militant about privacy and how patients' information was managed. But as time has moved on and people are more used to using social media, the ordinary person in the street has become much less sensitive about how their data is stored, what data is stored, the separation between users of that data. So, sometimes consulting community can give you a very clear understanding of what the actual practical ethical issues are. The public, you can consult public. It's done much less often. It's more expensive. The public are more likely to be able to help you post once you've developed a product and you're looking at putting in applications to the MBS or the TGA. The public is is likely to assist you in terms of cost effectiveness if you're able to come up with a treatment that is either markedly better than the current treatment or is much more cost effective than the treatment people are getting now. The public also weighs in on ethics and also equality. Next slide, please. Any questions or comments? Michelle, Lisa?
I was just thinking about how you would reach out to the public. And I mean, obviously what comes to mind first is using social media and, the cheaper methods. But then I thought, well, wouldn't that be easy I guess it depends what you're asking, but it'd be easy for, bots and AI or whatever, someone to influence that as well.
Yeah, look, I think that dealing with the public, it becomes exactly the same challenge that every other manufacturer of a product faces, and that is that dealing with the public is a two-edged sword. There are ways with media management to control your engagement with the public, but it always is dangerous. So you need to be very certain about what it is that you're hoping to get from public consultation. Yeah, but I wouldn't rule it out. It sometimes is very helpful, and there are a number of very good examples of where a therapeutic product has been developed but not funded, and companies have used the public or community to advocate for that product being funded because it meets a need that they have. So, yeah, look at public consultation is not easy. Certainly, much harder than consumer involvement. So, if we move to when should we involve consumers, what happens mostly in current practice is that people do they do the concept development, they do the research, and then they bring in a consumer for involvement. And we argue that really you should involve the consumer at the conceptual level. So when you're coming up, when you have an idea for a product, consumers can help you either refine that product or they can market test an idea. So, run that product by me and I'll tell you how it fits in with the treatment regime that I currently have. And you might get those people from patients. It could be a consumer advocate. It could be the community. So definitely you should have consumer involvement before you commence your research. Most of the influence that I have, so when people come to me to ask for comments and actually make a change to how they do the research, relates to something in the methodology they've come up with that just isn't practical for an actual patient who has to live with the condition and is using the treatment. So you can read those things that are there. Translation is the one where you might involve the public. Translation, it can be about, for industry, it can be about creating demand. It can be about funding, and it can be about advocacy for actually using a treatment or a service. Next slide, please.
Going back to your point about, sorry if I can pipe in.
Yes,
going
please.
back to your point about using social media, particularly for things like translation, communicating your results or trying to obtain information from the public. From my experience in the research setting, things like using Facebook is a fantastic tool, but like you said, it is a double-edged sword. You can get a mixed bag of commentary that can be productive, some of it not so productive. So it is something to be wary of. You do put yourself out there and then you end up, you could end up giving yourself a negative image of what you're actually really trying to achieve. So the public can be really powerful, but at the same time you do need to be very mindful of how you use it.
Yeah, absolutely. When the reason that I developed Tonic, which is television sets in GP waiting rooms and hospital environments and pharmacies and things, was to try and narrow or accelerate the translation from the research being done findings being made to what the consumer knows, to try and just narrow that gap of translation. And that was the whole point of it. And I have to say that although that's a successful business, over time, its purpose, which is to provide high quality health information to patients in healthcare environments, changes. And, you know, in that instance, it was commercial and advertisers come into the market to use that space. So, yeah, I don't think there is any way of involving the public that guarantees you, or communicating widely to the public that guarantees you that you won't get negative pushback. Sometimes you can do that with controlled media releases and, you know, VTNs that can help you control it. But yeah, no, I absolutely agree with your experiences. It can be really difficult. If we can move now to how you can support consumer involvement. So involving consumers is not the same as involving people who are experts in their field. Firstly, you need to plan for that consumer involvement, and we'll talk about a plan in a little while. I think it might be the next slide, but you need to plan before you involve a consumer. Quite often, what happens in practice is that people realize they need consumer involvement, and so they grab a set of patients. And that is the situation in which people can be really dissatisfied with the feedback that they get from their consumer involvement. So plan for it early. You should be doing, have a strategy when you're doing your other strategic planning. Involve early and be willing to modify. And that's the other thing, is that there's no point having consumer involvement if you haven't allowed some flexibility in what you plan to do to change things because of the consumer involvement. If everything's fixed in stone, then consumer involvement is just a tick box and it's token, and that doesn't meet anybody's needs. You need to come at it with mutual respect. Although the consumer is not an expert in all of the scientific side, they are an expert in the things that they know. And quite often the consumer has lived experience that no one else sitting at the table has. And you need to respect their consumer involvement, give people time to speak, make sure that that person feels heard. Sometimes you'll be able to change your project in response to what they say. And if you are able to do that, you should feed back to them that change has been made. Sometimes you won't be able to do it, and you should feed back to them that you're not able to do it and the reasons why you can't do it, but still that you respected and valued their advice. You need to invest in relationships. So it's quite difficult to get good consumer representatives. There is much greater demand than there is supply at the moment. Consumer movement is trying to deal with that with various training programs, but if I was working in industry, I would be trying to develop a couple of relationships with consumer advocates, with patients or patient groups that allowed me to have ongoing access as my business changed. And that's what I think you should do, is invest in relationships and get some good people on board. Preparation is really important for a consumer to be effective in the job that they do. And that really means things like, if there's going to be a meeting, make sure you give them the papers 7 days in advance so that the consumer can read through the papers. They won't understand the technical stuff, but they should still have access to that material and be able to read through it. It also helps if, with your relationship, the consumer that you've involved is able to ask somebody questions. So that just helps the consumer to be prepared. And being prepared as a consumer means that you do feel like you can speak openly in a committee. And it also gives you, it means that the committee will get the best value from their consumer. The other thing is IT support. Quite often consumers are people who are retired because they're the people that have the time to be involved. And their IT setup is not equivalent to large organizations. I find myself that things like Zoom and Teams and Excel, things are constantly updated, and quite often my license doesn't update at the same rate that organizations are updating. And so you can be doing Zoom meetings 5 times and then your 6th one says, no, you don't have the license to do that. And then suddenly on the day of the meeting, at the time of the meeting, the consumer is excluded. So just make sure that you are checking in with your consumer, that their IT is working, and potentially you may need to extend a license if you're using software that they don't have access to. Remuneration is, there's several models of paying consumers offered by sort of the peak groups. So Consumers Health Forum in Canberra have a model. Most of the state consumer groups have models. The George Institute has a model. There's lots of them. It usually ranges at something like between $50 and $100 per hour for meeting times. I absolutely recommend that you pay a reading time prior to the meeting. It's respectful, and it also helps your consumer to understand that they need to be prepared. So when that meeting occurs, they need to have already done all of the reading. And then sharing achievements. So this is something that I feel really, really strongly about. Quite often there's consumer involvement. A consumer comes in, frequently they will speak from lived experience. It's, a not easy thing to do. They give advice and that's all they hear. So they never hear back how things are going, what changes occurred. I just think that when we go back to that mutual respect, I think that two-way communication is really important, and that's how you have sustained relationships.
I think that really.
Questions? Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to jump in.
Yeah,
I think it's really important to make that distinction between consumer involvement and consumer engagement, which is something that I started hearing when I first looked into developing a program. Could you explain a little bit about what the difference is? And then we've got a question as well around remuneration. So we'll jump back into that.
Sure. Sure. So consumer involvement and consumer engagement are pretty much similar terms. And they're used by people. Some people use consumer engagement, some people use consumer involvement. In a well-established consumer organisation, they may differentiate between the two. And I think in general, consumer engagement is at a higher level, whereas consumer involvement is more at a project level and is more specific. Michelle, is that the explanation that you have, or do you have a different definition of those two things?
I had in mind that engagement was more of a one-way, like you were saying before. But it's interesting that you're also saying that it's also at a higher level, say sitting at governments, sitting on an executive committee.
Oh, no, sorry. When I say higher level, I mean exactly what you're saying. So higher level means that you are telling the consumers information, but you're not necessarily involving them in a two-way process.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and I think that they are similar things.
Yeah. So things like a newsletter, you're communicating information out, but you're not really receiving that input back in.
Yeah, I think if you were producing a newsletter, you would even have trouble calling that engagement unless you were able to show that people were actually opening it and reading it. And yeah, I think we tend to be careful in situations in which people think they can conduct their consumer engagement or consumer involvement by sending a passive piece of information out to consumers. That actually isn't either engagement or involvement, I don't think, from my perspective.
Yeah, we've just had one of the attendees mention they think engagement can be a two-way or a one-way.
Yeah, look, I think that getting into those sorts of semantics, I have to say, when I first became a consumer representative more than 25 years ago, we would have great big networking meetings, so Australia-wide meetings funded by the government, where we would all fly into one place. And then someone would go, what actually is the definition of a consumer? And then half of the meeting would be spent debating that. My personal feeling is to step back from all of those issues. People use words in different ways, and that's fine. I mean, consumer involvement generally is described by so many different methodologies. People have different needs, and so the way that their consumer involvement evolves is different in response to those needs. And we need to make sure that consumer involvement can be all of those things and is all of those things, rather than narrow what it can actually be. So yeah, I tend to not involve myself in semantics.
I think Edmund is correct. I think it can take so many different forms. I mean, you can have, for instance, ARIA Research, they have, blind people in their company helping with the design of glasses for the blind. But that doesn't mean to say that, you wouldn't still then necessarily need to go out and get community engagement, where it just might be consultation as well. So I imagine there's quite a range.
Yeah, and I'm sure that if you had somebody with lived experience in the company, then it would be easier to identify who it is you need if you need to go to a wider consultation, because with their lived experience, they'll understand where the gaps are from their own personal experience.
I suppose that's one way of keeping costs down, is if you can. It's probably not always possible to have someone in the company who is a consumer as well.
Yeah, I think that helps. In terms of if what you're trying to do is to identify, minimize, and mitigate risk, you're probably going to get better information by going wider than a single person in the company. I think the value of having that person in the company is that they will assist with your planning for consumer involvement and make sure that it's high quality and highly relevant. And that's, you're not going to get a lot of value from consumer involvement unless it is highly relevant. So, certainly that would be very helpful.
We did also have a question on remuneration, but I do feel like you answered that already. It's what's the current best practice for compensating participating in consumer advisory work? Is there a standard approach you'd recommend for a startup without a dedicated research budget?
Sure. Yes. So there is standard things we recommend. Most people pay. So there's two issues. So one is whether or not your consumer representative needs to be paid GST together with their fee. So the fee ranges from about $49 to $53 an hour, depending on whether or not they have to pay GST. It's best to grab one of the remuneration policies from a well-developed organization, and they have them on their website. They're free. Certainly CHF has one. It might be limited to its members, but yeah, my email address is at the end. If you need to just contact me, I can send you something from an organization that's well set up. In terms of startups where consumer involvement is not funded, the situation that is being that is preferred now is that so within universities and medical research institutes, we are pushing for those institutes to provide small grants to researchers to do their consumer involvement in the early stages. Because until you actually get your grant from an application, you don't have the money to do anything, your consumer involvement or a whole lot of other things. So they provide a small grant of a few $1,000s to do your consumer involvement in the very early stages, so that your grant application is informed by consumer involvement. And then once you put in an application, it should have a budget line for consumer involvement. And most of the funding organisations that are putting out the government money, NHMRC, MRFF, I think even MTP Connect, when they do funding, they actually specifically ask for you to address that. So if you're a startup, you have a low budget, you can ask your consumer representative whether they actually need a fee. I know that there are other practices, things like giving gift certificates or other benefits, and that's for you to negotiate personally with a consumer representative. My recommendation is that you don't do that, that you find within your budget enough money to pay them that small amount. Be really organised so that you are not wasting hours with consumer involvement. Make sure that you know what you want. Make sure that you prepare your consumer to meet the needs of what you want, and then, have succinct periods. You might only need them for 2 to 3 hours in order to meet your needs, and you're talking about less than $200. So consumer involvement is generally not expensive, and really you get a massive amount of value out of it. The other thing that you can do if you're a startup and you really don't have that sort of money is put forward your proposals to some of the panels. So there's several panels exist now. I'm on 3 different panels for different organisations, and you can pitch your idea or your proposal to that panel. The panel usually has expertise from a wide range of people, academics, clinicians, and there usually is a consumer representative on that. So that can give you a little bit of guidance if you can't afford it. You should, though, be putting in a budget line for consumer involvement, exactly the same way as if you were making a Barbie toy, you would put in money for market research.
Absolutely. I think there are some inexpensive ways to also build up your program, I think, for very lean organizations. So you can have things like tiered involvement, so some low-cost ways to build in that participation in your program. So
absolutely. Consumer representatives are doing it because they are passionate about improving the healthcare system. So you generally find that they're not people asking for lots of money to be doing things. So I think that cost shouldn't be a barrier. Okay, if we're done there, we'll move on to a 5-step plan. Now, there are heaps of organisations, really good organisations, that have different plans for how you do consumer involvement. All of them are really good. What I've done here is review all of those plans and bring together essentially a very basic 5-step plan. I recommend that if you are in the planning stage, that you go to different organisations. Soon a slide will come up naming different organisations who have materials either free or at very low cost that can assist you with your planning. But for the moment, let's run through what a 5-step plan might look like. So this is sort of the stripped down basic consumer involvement that you can do. So the first step is to define the purpose of the consumer involvement. So be clear for your organisation, for your need, for this product you're developing, why do you need consumer involvement? And And then you need to decide which people, so going back to that patients, consumers, community, and public, which people representatives of which group do you need at different stages of your project? And as I said before, you might get one person who can do all of it, but sometimes you're going to need to have a different person. So as Michelle said, tiered involvement. With tiered involvement, as long as you understand the different stages that you're going to need different people at, tiered involvement is very, very effective, because you can be bringing in patients at one stage and then consumer reps at a different stage and community at a different stage. So it's important to understand who you're going to involve, why you're involving them, and at what stage you're going to involve them. You then need to describe the consumer role. So that is really for the people who might apply to be your consumer representative, so that they can understand what it is you need from them, what qualifications, what experience they need to have. It's really important when you're acting as a consumer representative. It's a really personal thing. Quite often, you're the only person representing all people with that condition, and you're sitting on a committee of experts, and it can be quite intimidating. And so all of the information that you can give to your consumer rep in advance helps to make your consumer rep feel secure that they have the appropriate knowledge to be sitting at that table as an expert for that condition. And so describing the consumer role is part of you being clear about what it is you need, but also reassuring the consumer that they have the appropriate experience or skills to be fulfilling that role. Some organisations are arguing that the consumer role should be linked to the remuneration, that people with higher levels of skills should be getting more money. I don't support that personally, but I guess that's something that you'll look at in your policy. I think that you can get very, very high quality consumer representation on those lower levels of pay, because most people involved in consumer representation are not doing it for the money. So you will come across, once you read different organisations' plans, you will come across those ideas. So what resources or support will be provided to consumer representative? So that needs to be, you need to have plans for how you're going to have your meeting papers in advance. If you think about the people in your organisation or clinicians or scientists who might be involved in your project, they will have ongoing information. So they're not at a meeting constantly having to absorb information and comment on things. It's different for the consumer. Sorry, I just need a drink of water. It's different for the consumer because they're coming at it fresh. So if they're working in your organisation, that's fabulous. If they're coming from outside, they're coming in fresh. So you need to get those papers to them in advance. And for most organisations, you need to have a process for how you're actually going to achieve that. And again, we go back to those things about IT support, make sure that they have all of those things so that they can participate in the meetings. Measuring effectiveness of your consumer involvement, learning and refining. And that is about having long-term relationships. So it's important to measure the effectiveness of consumer involvement so that you understand whether or not the involvement that you have conducted actually met the needs that you identified in the beginning. And if it didn't, then you need to look at how you're recruiting the right people at the right stage. I hear frequently criticism of consumer reps with people saying that they were no good at their job. And people with lived experience are always good at their job because they've got lived experience. If you're not getting value from that lived experience, you need to look at the context in which you're placing that person, whether you've got the right person for what it is you need at that time. A person who has experience of their hip surgery is not going to be able to do the consumer representation. So, yeah, I have to say that for me, it's getting a bit old hearing about a consumer representative not being good enough because they wanted to talk about their surgery. My answer to that is make sure that you're getting the right person for the right time. So that's the 5-step plan. Are there any questions there?
I did have a comment with regards to resources and support. And it relates back to the remuneration, but also really to respect. So things like, if you are going to be asking a representative to participate in the work that you're doing, things like, public transport, supporting that ticket, reimbursing for cab charges, cab fares, that's also something that needs to be factored into the budget. And on top of that, it's the admin work that's involved in relationship building and then organizing meetings with your consumer representative. So those sorts of things are also resources that a lot of people can underestimate, I think.
I think that's true. Although there are some small startups with very low levels of resources, and they still will get benefit from consumer involvement. So we need to find ways of making sure that cost and resources are not a barrier to everybody using consumer involvement. Larger organizations, they should have a strategy for how they're going to involve consumers. That's a long-term strategy across the organization. We can have different expectations of them, but I wouldn't want to be setting up barriers for startups to actually be getting genuine consumer involvement at the same time. But yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you. If we go to the next slide. So this is just some organizations that have frameworks for consumer involvement. All of them are valuable in different ways. The NHMRC also has a toolkit. I'm not going to go through all of the different ones. I just wanted to put that slide in. So if anybody is doing their planning and they want to go back to those organizations, you can watch the webinar afterwards and just pull up that slide and have a list of organizations that you might get information from. Okay.
And it's not the right time to just ask this question we had. What panel were you referring to when we can pitch an idea for valuable feedbacks with consumer insight?
Sure. So ANZAC is one. So I work mostly in cardiac areas. So that's the Australian and New Zealand Alliance for Cardiac Trials. So they put forward panels multiple times a year, and you can pitch to them if your product is within that area. But I do know that other disease areas have similar panels. So diabetes, cancer, there's multiple panels for multiple types of cancer. There are those panels available.
Probably worth doing your research and reaching out to the peak bodies who'd probably be aware for certain.
Yeah. So I would think that ACTA might know of those panels. The panels are predominantly put together for their scientific value. So it helps researchers bring in a funding proposal, so a research proposal, and pitch it, and then they get feedback from experts in those areas about their proposal. ASTRA also has panels, so that's the Australian Stroke Heart Research Accelerator. They run panels every year, and they're very high quality.
One of the research centres that NTB Connect developed?
Yeah, there are a lot. So I guess it depends on what area you work in. But I'm sure that you will be able to find those panels. And if you can't, you could email me and we'll try and find them out for you. My email address will be at the end. So if we can move on to the next slide. I'm getting close to the end. So this will just take 2 minutes. So how do you find the right consumers? So, this is a huge problem, because the bottom line is that demand for consumer involvement is far greater than currently we're able to provide high quality consumer representatives. So to get them, I would recommend that you go to health consumer organisations, and Consumers Health Forum is the national peak. There should be a peak in each state. They're usually called the Health Consumer Council of, and whatever your state is. You can go to disease-specific expert panels like ANZAC. You can go to patient groups. Hospitals quite often have patient groups for specific diseases that you can contact. You can also contact, if you have a relationship with individual consumers, you can representatives, you can contact them, and quite often they can give you referrals. And I have to say that's the method that I use, because I can reach out to half a dozen people who all refer to different people. So it allows a bit of a network. The network for consumer involvement is missing. It's a recognised gap, and there's several groups, particularly researchers, working towards filling that gap, so that it is much easier for researchers to be able to contact the right person at the right time to get high quality consumer involvement. That's the end of my information. I hope that was helpful. Michelle and Lisa, is there anything you would like to say, or any questions?
I just have commentary on how important and essential it is to be involving consumers' lived experience, really, in research programs, in the development of products that are supposed to be benefiting the community. It just makes it more relevant, more powerful. Not only do you have a product that is more relevant to the community, but you also have a champion and an advocate for what you're building.
I absolutely agree. I think that when we look at the challenges with research between concept and translation, and that 12-year gap, 12-year time period that it takes, one of the ways of shortening that period is with good consumer representation, because they can do translation as well. So I absolutely agree with you, Michelle. I think that there are all sorts of benefits to be gained, and those benefits are being gained more frequently.
I have a heap of questions.
I'm sorry.
No, it's just such an interesting topic. I'll ask one before I go, given it doesn't seem there's anyone else who's got any more questions. Are there any trends you foresee coming in the future in terms of consumer-driven design that might be applicable?
Yeah, look, I would like to say that I have enough knowledge to answer that question, but I don't. Yeah, I don't, other than, really models that are already existing, and that is that you involve consumers the same way that you do market research for other industries. You involve them early, you test ideas. I think there is going to be, in the future, as more funding becomes available for consumer involvement, there's going to be hubs of consumer involvement that is able to do things like generate research projects in its own right for unmet need. And I think that will be innovative.
AI as well, I'm sure will change quite a few things.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think, things change slowly, and quite often consumer involvement is responsive. It would be really good to have the resources to be able to move that towards being generative rather than responsive.
I think also reaching out into the cold community, so culturally, linguistically diverse. It's such an underserved area, a population of the community that really does need to have a voice.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it can't have one voice. So we can't, what happens quite often is, well, one is that there is no multicultural voice on most committees. But even where there is, there can't just be one voice. It's such a diverse group of people, and their needs vary so significantly that we actually need to have multiple voices. And, you know, the other thing that is a weakness in consumer involvement is still we don't have enough involvement by First Nations people. And that is not usually because people don't want to involve them. It's usually because there's not the resources within that group to be able to meet the needs of everybody who needs them to comment.
Definitely a challenge that I know a few groups are working on. Well, I think we've come to the time, so I just want to thank you once again, Karen, so much for taking the time. I find you very inspiring that you've had these negative life experiences that you've turned positive and sharing your feedback and guidance. It's very helpful, and I'm sure the companies here would have really appreciated hearing all those tips and advice that you shared today. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. And if anybody is stuck, my email address is there at the bottom of the screen. And to a limited extent, I can help people that are stuck to get consumer representatives to help them.
Thank you for being so generous with your time. All right, and if we could just ask one small favor for everyone leaving, if you could just quickly do the very short survey, we'd really appreciate it. And that's it for today. Thank you very much.